We tend to have a few people joining late, and we do record these sessions anyway, but we don't really record the Q&A part. So if you have any questions to ask afterwards, that's only for people who've attended the sessions. I think what we'll do now is we'll just get started. I typically try to keep these sessions very short, to around 15 to 20 minutes, and then give you time to ask questions and take more of an interactive approach to them. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it. It's good to see everyone here this evening. I hope everyone's doing well. So for those of you who don't know who I am, and I'm sure some of you do, a little brief introduction about me, Norman Lowe. I'm a Chartered Institute Securities and Investments qualified financial planner and wealth manager. I've got 22 years experience in the offshore markets. I'm now part of the Lawson's Advisory Network, which has licenses around the world, including Switzerland and the UAE. More importantly, though, I'm a husband, father, and an avid sci-fi fan. So please feel free to ask me questions about that as well. So today's talk, as I mentioned, really is a 15-minute or under session, and I really want to give you a bit of food for thought. That's what these sessions are. I do them once a month on various subjects, and I'm always open to suggestions for topics as well. So please do stick around as well for the Q&A, and please, if you've got any questions, note them down and ask them at the end. So marshmallows, that's where we're going to start today. Back in the 1960s, there was a psychologist by the name of Walter Mischel, and he began a series of experiments with preschool-aged children. Mischel's researchers would place a favorite treat, such as a marshmallow, in front of a child and then leave the room. However, before leaving, they would inform the child that they would return after 10 or 15 minutes, and that if the child had not eaten the marshmallow, they would come back and give them a second marshmallow as well. So they would get double their marshmallows on the condition that they waited. As anyone who has experience with children would know, most of the children absolutely did not wait and gobbled up their marshmallow as soon as they could. So Mischel and his researchers noted all this data down, and they also tracked the progress of these children who took this test, and there were many of them. At the end of the presentation, I'll share the results of them because you'll find them to be quite interesting, I'm sure. So today's topics are really more about definitions. Our psychology is something that could be compared to the operating system of a computer. We approach everything according to how we think, how we see the world. A damaged, an incomplete, or an outdated operating system can have cascading catastrophic effects in all areas of our lives. It's simply not just about money. This is why self-examination, and honest self-examination particularly, is a must. The topics I'm going to highlight today are all surrounding something called cognitive bias, which, as I mentioned, is the way we understand events. It's the way we see the world. It's our operating system. And that's really something I want you to keep in mind today when we go over these points. The first thing, overconfidence, a type of cognitive bias. Anyone who works with anyone else in the world, as most of us do, will occasionally come across someone who can be almost annoyingly overconfident, and you know that they simply don't have the ability to do what they say they're going to do. This isn't the same as being confident, because confidence is quite a humble thing. You say that you want to do something, you're going to give it a go, but you also understand your limitations. Overconfidence is when you believe you don't have any limitations. There's nothing for you to learn. You know it all. It's essentially accuracy that's excessive about one's personal beliefs. In investment terms, overconfidence comes into play when people think that they can pick the winning investments time and time again, or most commonly, they think that they can time the market. There's a whole body of data about market timing, and I could do presentations on that. I've talked about this in the past, but it's often driven by overconfidence. The problems with overconfidence is it tends to lead to taking on too much risk and to making poor investment decisions, which are generally decisions which are not made with your own goals in mind, and particularly not with an honest appraisal of your own goals in mind. The second type of cognitive bias, which is very common, is loss aversion. Obviously, nobody wants to lose money. It's not something that's a pleasant thing to see when it happens. But when you have loss aversion as a cognitive bias, you start going to disproportionately great lengths to avoid even perceived losses. It's when you start having so much pain, so much worry, so much fear about losing even small amounts of money that you stop thinking about what the potential gain would be. And what happens with loss aversion is it tends to make us avoid taking what I would call necessary risks. All investment carries some sort of risk or another. And generally, that risk can be mitigated by doing your due diligence and taking your time. The best investments often are the ones that go on for years and years. What happens with loss aversion is people see, for example, a stock portfolio starts to go down, which is quite normal, especially in the early days of an investment, or like we see now, and they just sell out immediately because the pain is so intense. They no longer are thinking rationally and seeing that, well, it's going down now, but stocks go up and down, and over 5 or 10 years, I'm going to see it go up. The third type of cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance is herd mentality, another very, very common one. I've seen this many times in my career, which is where people start asking questions. I get this when I meet with a new client particularly, and they ask me the question, what is everyone else doing? What's popular right now? What's hot right now? Advertisers and marketers play up on this. They'll tell you about the hottest thing, the latest thing. They'll tell you about the buzzwords, the buzz markets. Property in Dubai is flying. Oh, you need to invest in this country and that country. This is what's going on. And so people start following the herd. They see everyone else is doing it, so they do it. And of course, with investments, first and foremost, you have to be setting goals, and your goals may not be aligned with what the herd is doing. All herd mentality is not necessarily wrong, but it will be wrong if it's not in line with your goals. If, for example, you're hearing a lot of people talking about investing in stocks, but you've got a 2-year investment horizon, stocks are probably not appropriate to you. So it's all about following the crowd, or rather not following the crowd. Confirmation bias is another popular one that I see, let's say, if that's the right word to use. It's where we have fixed ideas in our heads. We know what's going on. We've read something, perhaps we've read a book, we went to a webinar, that sort of thing. And so we start looking for evidence that backs up what we already think. That tends to lead to dismissing evidence that could be contrary, because let's face it, if you have to start weighing up things that go against preconceived ideas, that's quite a lot of work, and we can be forgiven for that. We are essentially creatures of habit, and so we like to keep on doing the things that we do, and we like things to be the same, our routines to be the same. When something comes along that's different, it can be a bit frightening, and frankly, we're just not interested in it. So essentially, to summarize that up, if it supports my beliefs, it's true. And if it contradicts my beliefs, it's wrong. If you find yourself in a position like this, it's time to take a step back. Just take a breather and really think about whether or not you're appraising the situation from a more dispassionate view. What tends to happen with confirmation bias as well is, because you tend to have an over-reliance on existing ideas, is you tend to lean towards certain types of investments. And even within that investment arena, say, for example, property, you don't diversify enough. So you end up only buying in one city, one town, sometimes even one street. I've seen that, believe me, where people only buy in one area. Where they're trying to build a portfolio, they should be spreading themselves out over geographical areas, over nations, continents even. And I think one of the most, another one, let's say popular, definitely one of the one I see the most is emotional decision making. When I first started out in the financial services industry a long, long time ago, I was working for Zurich International Life. And when we were doing our training, something they said to us is that everyone that we will be meeting and talking to will ultimately be making a decision on one of two factors. The first one would be need, and the other one would be greed. Now, need could be things like, I'm 45, I'm 50, I don't have a pension, I don't have that much longer to go, panic stations, what do? I've got to start something. Greed could be, someone on LinkedIn sent me a message offering me 20% per annum. That looks brilliant. I'm going to go for that immediately. And within those, you've got subsections, anxiety and other kinds of fears and greeds that drive you. Essentially, what it does, though, is it creates an impulsive decision-making process, which is not based on sound and correct principles. And that leads you to go down the wrong way. So, for example, if you're making an emotional decision-making and you're pushing yourself too quickly because you're afraid or because you see greed, it tends to lead to things like it's easier to be scammed. Number one, if you come to my webinar last month about scams, we talked about this in quite a bit of detail. And a lot of scams are based on the need or greed. People need money. We all need money. It's been a bad couple of years for quite a lot of us. And if somebody comes along and dangles some, double-digit returns to you, you may just jump for it without even doing any homework on it. So emotional decision making is a big problem. However, I want to add the caveat with emotions. Emotions are a wonderful servant. When you're thinking about your goals, when you're thinking about what you want to get out of life, what are you looking to do? Most goals will have a dollar figure, a pound figure, a euro figure, whatever currency you work with attached to those goals. It's important to use your emotions when deciding on your goals. However, when you decide how to get to your goals, close the door on the emotions and think with your rational brain only. The last one is something called anchoring bias. It's related to some of the others. Essentially, it's when you have an initial judgment, an initial, you do something for the first time and it works well, you're happy with it, so you just keep doing it. You only do that, in fact. You get a piece of information, perhaps it's from somebody that you like and you trust, so you don't look at other information, you don't think about it, go away. A very common thing I see is when people get into the stock market when markets are rising, and of course their portfolios start to jump up and it looks very nice. So they think that's how it's always going to be, and they do more of the same. And even when they're advised, well, let's do some other things, let's spread out your investments according to time, not just according to the type of asset, so that there's investments maturing every 2 or 3 years, they just stick to one thing. Another thing that's very common, and you see this a lot over here in Dubai with the property market, is pricing. Pricing is a huge, huge thing. It's a massive decision maker for a lot of people. And of course, pricing is important. You don't want to be paying more than you need to for something. But at the same time, if pricing is the only thing you're weighing your entire decision-making process on, then that can lead you to wrong places as well. So it's always important to take a range of factors. At the same time, we're not talking about going into deep analysis and putting on a mathematician's hat and overthinking situations. But it is important to take stock of what you're doing and why you're doing it. As I mentioned right at the beginning, our brains and our psychology is our operating system. So we need to make sure that's functioning properly. And sometimes that's beyond the remit of someone like me when I'm talking to my clients. You need to then bring in people like psychologists or qualified coaches that can really help you sit down and examine why you think the way you do, why you're doing the things you do, why perhaps your values are not necessarily aligned with your goals, which is what's holding you back. Perhaps you need to do something, but you're just not getting around to it for one reason or another. And that sometimes is just your operating system doing what it wants to do, and you're trying to do something else, and you have to get them aligned. That's a whole skill in and of itself. And it's something that I'm more than happy to talk to people about, and I can even recommend people who've helped my clients with this process. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, marshmallows. Dr. Michel's test. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback there. Somebody's got their microphone on, but that's gone now. Yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, the experiment in the 60s with Dr. Michel's the children, let's call them, not his personal children, where he had children sit down in a room, they put a marshmallow or another treat in front of the child, and they told the child they were leaving for 10 or 15 minutes. And when they come back, if the marshmallow is still there, they'll give them 2 marshmallows. And of course, most of them didn't do that. But the results of that test were very, very interesting, because what they did is they actually followed the progress of those children throughout the 60s and 70s, well into their adulthood. And they came up with some very interesting conclusions based on that very simple test. And essentially, we can sum them up in 3 ways. The children who didn't wait for that second marshmallow, who didn't delay their gratification, were often found, as a group average, to be less physically fit. Now, physical fitness is one of those things that you have to keep doing it. You don't see immediate results, like with money. It's not something that works overnight for most people, unless you're lucky enough to win a lottery or inherit a lot. We tend to be putting away money and investing slowly and building ourselves up. And so delayed gratification is a huge part of getting physically fit. You have to make a habit of it over years. And of course, many of them were also financially not as stable as the ones that did wait for the second marshmallow. And lastly, when they started to scan them, they did MRI scans, they actually found that they had less developed prefrontal cortexes. Now, that's the part of the brain that actually deals with impulse control. Now, this all sounds very terrible, like, well, we're born a certain way and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, the mind is a lot like a muscle. It can be trained, and with habits and repetition, we can change our operating system. And that's really what I want you to think about today, is where your operating system is now, and how do we get it to the point where if you were one of those children, you could resist that first marshmallow, delay that gratification for just a little while, and then get that second reward, a greater reward later on. There are many, many methods of training the mind, of training our psychology. They could fall into two categories of carrot and stick. Some of them are quite painful, to be frank, just as it is with exercise, especially in the beginning. But you can rewire yourself. As I mentioned, I do work with professional coaches who help with this as well. And for some of my clients where we've just found it's an uphill battle to get going, even though their rational minds understand what needs to be done, sometimes we do bring in a professional to help from the psychological sphere of things. Whatever the case with you, where you are now in your journey, I'd be more than happy to chat with you on a one-to-one basis if you're having any personal challenges when it comes to money or improving your financial decision-making. And with that, I've kept it well under 15 minutes, I'm glad to say, so you've not had to listen to me talk for too long. I'd like to open it up now to a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, I'll stop sharing the screen. I'd also like to invite you, if you don't already follow my blog, to reach out. It's a free blog that I do every week. There are articles on many different subjects to do with personal finance, covering a lot of different jurisdictions around the world, particularly focused on the internationally minded investor.